Hello and welcome to Success is Never Accidental. I'm Lynn Payton and I'm passionate about helping individuals and organizations to get better results. And on this podcast, I get to interview some highly successful people from all over the globe and across all industries and sectors so that we can learn a little bit about their formula for success and recognize some of the component factors. And I'm very excited today to have as my guest Patricia Lewsley-Mooney CBE, who served as the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Northern Ireland from 2007 to 2015. And she was awarded the CBE, a highly distinguished honour for her services. As a former MLA, and for those of you outside of Northern Ireland, MLAs are members of the Legislative Assembly, which is the governing body for Northern Ireland. And as a local councillor, Patricia has a long-standing track record of advocating for children, young people and women across a range of policy issues. During her time as a councillor, she introduced the first and only Disability Equal Opportunity Officer post in local government, and she was also instrumental in establishing Shop Mobility Belfast, a charity which provided free daily use of mobility equipment. As a member of the Legislative Assembly, she established all-party working groups on disability, children, ethnic minorities and poverty. She's committed to promoting social change and achieving social justice for the most marginalised and disenfranchised. She also promotes citizenship through her leadership roles in various organisations, and including the Training for Women Network. She's currently a member of the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action Board and chair of Play Board. And we're delighted that she's taken time to share some of her insights with us today. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us today. I expect you're in the middle of a start of another busy week.
Yeah, thank you so much to Lynn for inviting me on. I'm delighted. And yes, it's a very busy week because in a couple of days' time, I'm retiring from NICMA after 9 years at the Helm. So it's a kind of a bittersweet time. I'm looking forward to my retirement. My husband's retired as well. So the both of us, we've holidays and things planned, just making sure that we make life to the full, as the saying goes. So yeah, loving it.
So tell me this, how did you even get into local politics?
That was by accident. It wasn't by design. Somebody told me to put my name on the ballot paper. It'd be all right. I wouldn't get elected. And hence I got elected in 1993 to Belfast City Council.
Amazing. And then you very quickly got embroiled in lots and lots of policy issues, particularly in relation to women's rights and children's rights. But tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're most proud of achieving in those days.
Well, I suppose early on I realised that I actually had a wee bit of influence. I didn't, when you see politicians from the outside, you don't really understand the role. And it was when I was in the Belfast City Council, I realised that I could utilise some of the skills that I had. So I did a lot of negotiating. So the things that I'm most proud of is that Belfast City Council became as accessible as possible. And it had the first and only in local government disability stroke equal opportunities officer. We also put in place a policy to employ people with learning disabilities.
And really, I mean, that wasn't common in those days. So what sort of obstacles did you have to overcome?
Well, I don't think it was so much obstacles as it was common sense. I've always been a person who brings the facts with me and the detail. So when I'm making an argument, then I have all of that behind me. But it was kind of like the next step. We'd already put the policy in place to employ somebody with learning disabilities because I'd been out at an organisation called DataLink. And there was a young boy there, Philip, who was amazing at reprographics. But when he went for an interview, he went to pieces. So people were saying, oh, no, we couldn't. And Belfast City Council took him on. And as a result of that, then we put the policy in place and then adding on to that, working with my other colleagues, the likes of Nigel Dodds and others, we then put in place a disability stroke equal opportunities officer, first in local government.
And it's really quite organic, isn't it? Because once you get a start and once you get other people on board, things then can take off.
Absolutely.
But you talked about getting your colleagues on board. How important, and the other word you used was influencing, how important is collaboration in terms of getting any significant policy change, Patricia?
I think it's about bringing people with you, and it's about, I always bring the kind of common sense approach. So I would say, there wasn't a politician in the chamber that didn't have somebody in their constituency that would gain from this. So
Mhm.
it was kind of like a win-win from the beginning. Now it wasn't always plain sailing, but when you take it to the level even of the assembly and looking for a Bill of Rights and a Bill of Rights forum, did I bring the two of them together and get nothing, or did I take them separately and maybe get one, eventually getting the other? And that took some time to negotiate with, at that stage, the DUP. So Gregory Campbell and I sat down and created a form of words that allowed his party to be able to sit round the table in the forum. Now, sadly, it didn't come to fruition and we didn't see the Bill of Rights at that stage, but they were involved in that right through the process.
So
So,
you're looking for common ground all the time. You're trying to see if you can get people to have a common goal, and then you make it easy for them to say yes.
yeah, I mean, the thing about it is there's nobody who doesn't know someone who is affected by a disability or a special need, especially nowadays when we see the number of children coming through our schools. So it's that common ground that's saying this is about delivering services for people. It's not about whether it's better for you or better for me.
And what would you say have been the main accomplishments for folks with disability over the last 20 years?
Well, we've had the Disability Discrimination Act, which has been great, and it's about how that's implemented. And I suppose for me, during my time as Commissioner for Children, we looked at how we could support parents when they were going through the appeals process because it was very daunting, even though it was supposed to be a very informal process. They were faced with maybe 5 or 6 people, and if you're not very articulate, it makes it very difficult. So we were able to put a package together and give those parents support when they were going towards those tribunals that they felt at least they had their voices heard, which I think is the important part.
And tribunal is a scary word for people anyway, isn't it? So providing information and awareness about how it worked, but then having a support person must have been a huge kind of help for them.
Yes, very much so. And as I said to you, all most parents want is the best for their children. And when children were being and needed statemented, you had maybe many years ago, not so much now, you had a principal saying, but I use that special needs budget for all the children in the school. You're going to deny them the new library or something else where you're thinking, well, this is my son or my daughter and they actually need help. And until I get this statement, I'm not going to get that help. So sometimes it was difficult for those parents to navigate that because they just assumed the principal or those in the schools knew what was right or wrong. So it was difficult for them, and we were able to help them navigate that.
And for those listening who may not understand our statementing progress process, that was the only way that young people with disabilities could get assistance within the classroom to help them attain a higher educational standard.
Yeah.
You talked about being the Commissioner for Children, and that's where you and I first met all those years ago. So, what attracted you to that post? Were you hoping to get it as well?
Well, that was interesting because during the time whenever I went into the assembly first, I, along with Eileen Bell, set up the all-party working group on children and young people. And the first thing that did was we brought all of those that worked in the sector together to help shape the policy and the legislation. So the first thing we lobbied for was a Commissioner for Children. And then we looked at that legislation, and I sat on the committee at the centre that actually put the legislation through. And obviously, we seen Nigel Williams, who was the first Commissioner for Children and Young People. And sadly, he was only in that post, I think, about 18 months when he took ill. He had cancer. He had a reprieve and then he died. And they put out the post for advertisement, and some of those in the children's sector came to me and said, "Would you not think about going for it?" And I went, "No, I couldn't do that job." And they advertised but couldn't appoint. So they re-advertised. So there was a few more came along. I went and spoke to my party leader at the time, Mark Durkin, and he thought I'd be good at the job, and he gave me the pros and cons, and I thought, well, I'll apply for it and see do I get it, and hence I got the job. So that's how that came about. So it wasn't something that I had initially thought of, but I suppose with the support of the sector, it kind of meant something to me. And I thought, well, if I can go in and make a difference, because the core for me was around, my biggest priority was around participation of young people and having their voice heard, you know.
And we'd all lobbied for that for so many years. I think ever since the UN Convention on the Child and International Year of the Family, we'd all been lobbying. So it was a delight to have that post come into fruition. What are some of your, would you describe as some of the biggest successes? Because you were in post from what, 2007 to 2015, was it?
Yeah. I suppose some of the research that we did a huge piece of research around 14 young people who had taken their life by suicide. And
Yeah.
it showed up, and it was the first time I think we heard people talk about early childhood adversities. So, some of those children had 3 and 4, maybe living in families where there was alcohol abuse, domestic violence, young teenage pregnancy, all of that. Um, and I think that was the start of people really talking about the issue of suicide here in Northern Ireland, especially when it came to young people. Um,
And very, very high in West Belfast, and particularly among young males.
well, the youngest was a 13-year-old male,
Mhm,
and he was 13, and his mother was 14 when she had him, and
mhm.
obviously living in a family home. And the only person that he felt that he could be close to was his grandmother, and she had died. And it was his last night of bereavement counselling then that he took his own life, sadly.
Mhm, mhm,
So there were lots of early childhood adversities that probably weren't picked up because they kept under the radar.
mhm.
And so that's why you would have supported different kinds of projects, I suppose, and programs like Bernardo's that went into schools at nursery level and were able to do a story and very quickly pick up on children's their body language, and maybe have that wee conversation with them afterwards to see was there anything wrong or not. So they were picking things up quickly and early. The problem is they're funded and then they're not funded, and so unless the school can afford to pay for that, it didn't really happen. But they were some of the things that came out of that. And the other big one was our piece of work that we did on the welfare reform and the
Mhm,
actual impact that would have on children.
mhm,
Because
mhm,
even though they're not the recipient of the benefit, they would feel the outworking of that if there was benefits cut. At one stage we were having conversations with the Department of Communities, and they were saying, well, we leave the mother's portion out of that if she doesn't go and find work. And I'm saying, so what, does she put the heating on in one room and she sits in another? Does she make everybody their dinner and doesn't make herself any? You have to be realistic. And the big one that you'll be interested in, that we went to Lord Freud with, or Feud or whatever his name was at the time, um, was the one around multiple occupancy and that whole issue around safeguarding. We don't
yeah,
have huge numbers of houses with multiple occupancy. Yes, we have quite a few now with students and otherwise. But
mhm,
for a father then to take his children to maybe a house, or a mother where there's multiple occupants and they've never been vetted or even looked at, then that would have been very difficult. But again, I don't know whether that fell on deaf ears, but we managed to get that through here in Northern Ireland. That was a bit different.
And a couple of things you said earlier was like common sense isn't all that common. So people make decisions in this department over here without any kind of sense of the impact of that on another kind of department or another part of the family. How did you manage to get all party interest in so many different things? Like, what is the process? How do you make that successful?
I think that's where again it's your collaboration and partnership, but I also think it's how you build up your own reputation,
Mhm,
and how you can work with people that makes a difference. And for me, I was able to work across the parties, and I had good working relationship with MLAs that I could say, look, could you give me support on this? and they were decent enough to come back and say, well, yes, we can support you. No, we can't. So at least I knew where I stood and
Mhm.
what more work I needed to do to be able to get the thing over the line. But
Mhm.
again, very many of the issues that I talked about were common to all MLAs. It
Yeah.
didn't mean to say that I got what I needed all of the time, but for the majority of the time, you could see the change. And sometimes it was small changes. It didn't have to be big ones, you know. So when you look at some of the legislation that goes through, you know, if you can get that cross-party support, even putting private members' bills up, and the one was on putting area child protection committees on a statutory footing, you know.
Well, that was one that was very dear to my heart, having chaired one for many years, years and years ago.
And sadly, then never seen the light of day because it was due to go to the chamber the day of suspension. But was great to be able to see it come to fruition 6 years later in the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland. And it was nice for me because at the beginning of those debates, I got a mention because of the work that we'd done. And again, had got the cross-party support, had done all of that work so that we knew that when it got to the Assembly, we were hoping it would have gone through because you'd done the groundwork.
So sometimes I ask people, so what happens when you made a bump in the road? Everything's going really well, but you had a massive bump in the road when the assembly closed down.
Mhm.
What happened then? I mean, how did people actually continue to do their work in any kind of meaningful way in the absence of that forum?
So it's interesting that you asked that question because for a minute or two, the All Party Working Group on Children kind of didn't meet. And then the sector came to me and said, look, could we kind of revamp this and get it up and going again? And during that time, because there had been funding specifically for children and young people, and that was going to be lost because it was coming to an end. So again, we lobbied and we got the children and young people's package. Added to that, we were asking for a minister for children, and during direct rule, that was Marie Eagle.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also then we had a cross-party group that would have met Marie Eagle on an ongoing basis. And she very kindly allowed me to set the agenda for that because I was able to work with the other parties and everybody had their own. So like Eileen Bell was interested in integrated education. Um, I'm thinking of Arlene Foster, who was interested in rural. So everybody had a kind of a role. It wasn't about bringing people to the table and dictating to them what could be done. But if we could set the agenda, then there was a better chance of seeing change.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to do that. And then unfortunately, when the assembly got up and running again, then and I had moved on, it kind of fell apart. So, and then we had the junior ministers rather than a minister for children. So
And really, that demonstrates, doesn't it, how as leaders you have to have, you said reputation, you have to be able to influence, you have to be able to get stakeholder buy-in. So these are all absolute leadership qualities, aren't they?
see, when I'm looking at myself, I don't think of all of that. I just think there's a job to be done and I have to get it done. And it's how can I bring people with me in order for that to happen. But yes, I suppose in the bigger sense, I am a leader and I try to bring people with me. And I do. I've tackled the difficult situations as well. It's not just all about the quick wins, but sometimes it takes a lot of negotiation and sometimes you get nothing out of it. So it's about, as I would say, pick your battles, you know?
Yeah. Well, tell us about something where it kind of got stuck and you weren't able to move it on.
Well, I suppose the Bill of Rights was one of those where we seen all the work go into the forum, and at the end of it, we didn't see, even though they produced a Bill of Rights, the Unionists couldn't support it. And it was sad because they were around the table during all of that. So, what was there that at that stage they couldn't have raised that we could have seen it? And I think for me, that was the biggest disappointment during my time there. But also again, the welfare reform bill, we've seen that welfare reform come in and we've seen how women were affected by that in particular. Um,
But it's
even
also another example, isn't it, that you can't afford to like sit back and grieve for too long. You have to say, okay, what's next? Get on, and then keep influencing something else to get positive movement.
yeah. And I think what you want to do is try to, I always say if you can make a difference in one person's life, then you've succeeded. So from that perspective, it's important that we don't expect to kind of make like change for every individual as such, but
Yeah.
it's also the people that you meet along the way. Like when I was in Commissioner for Children, you seen some of the most amazing young people, very articulate, high flyers, but you also seen the poor children at the other end, children that were involved in the whole tobacco in Ballymurphy. And them saying, oh, when we're out playing, somebody comes along with a car, winds the window down and shoots at us, and we all run because we don't know who they're shooting at. To children that live in poverty. And I remember when I was leaving Nick, I went out and met some of the school children that I'd visited over the years. And I was saying to them, if you had all the money in the world, what would you buy? And one wee girl said, oh, I would buy a pony. And somebody else said, oh, I'd buy all these sparkly things. And somebody else said, I'd buy this special dog. When I met a young boy in West Belfast whose mummy was on benefit and explaining how she spent that money. And I said to him, if you had all the money in the world, he was about 10, what would you buy? And he said, can of Coke and a packet of crisps. And I went, and that's because he must see his friends every week going to the shop and just buying a can of Coke and a pat, and he can't afford it. And I think his mum was a wee bit taken aback because obviously she never realised because he never said, because he knew there was no money. But just going from that one extreme to the other, we don't realise how many of our children today are living in poverty and
Mhm.
why they don't talk about it because they're afraid and probably been told by parents don't be saying anything and, sitting in the cold because there's no heating. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was a very humbling experience meeting some of those children, as well as the amazing young people out there that are, as I say, very articulate. And
And aren't we very blessed when our work actually allows us to come face to face with those amazing children, the amazing ones who are just at survival level, and then the amazing ones who are able to make more of it.
mm,
Participation and involvement in young people in policy making was one of your big,
absolutely.
um, absolutely goals when you were commissioner. So, what were some of the ways that children were able to influence policy?
So every time that I went to meet a minister, I brought a young person with me that was affected by the issues that that minister was responsible for. So Conor Murphy at the time was infrastructure. So a young person came talking about the cost of transport and all of that. I had a young person when we were looking at the banning of physical punishment, and we took them to meet the First Minister. And
Mhm.
and the First Minister then, Peter Robinson, said, well, I had three children. I only smacked one once and I never did it again. I felt so guilty. And she said, well, then why are you not supporting the banning of physical punishment?
Yeah,
And he
yeah.
was very, give the politician's response, it's a party thing, and I have to be guided by what the party wants. So, and then we had a young girl who went to meet John O'Dowd, who was Minister for Education at the time, and she had been excluded from school and she had a learning disability. Her mother had to leave work, so that was financial hardship. And he took on board quite a number of things that she had said to him, and he wrote back to her on a number of occasions telling her what he'd done. So it's not about me. Well, it was my job to represent all children and young people, but it was also about me allowing them a voice because they're the people that are affected by it.
And children bring out the humanity, don't they, sometimes in people who are busy or have got big jobs or whatever. But you would have also had great opportunities to network with commissioners and ombuds,
Mm.
men and women from other countries. How did you benefit, or how did we benefit as a
Well,
country
again,
from that?
yeah, interesting. And I was the president of the European Network of Ombudsmen and Commissioners, which was a great experience for a year.
Of
Uh,
course you were, Patricia.
yeah.
Of course you were.
And Iceland, I always looked at with envy because they had just introduced the banning of physical punishment. And I remember asking the commissioner there, what was it that they did that actually made a difference? And she said, we put the building blocks in so that eventually when we got to where we needed to be, it was just automatic. It was a good way of incorporating the UNCRC because we had put all of these blocks in there, like the banning of physical punishment, like equality for children, like the goods and services, all of those things had been put in place. So their government just seen this as the next step, which was
Mhm.
interesting for me. And recently having that conversation with the new Commissioner for Children and Young People, Chris Quinn, because he was asking me the same. And I was saying it's about putting those building blocks in so that then the next process is just incorporating the UNCRC. But I also think it's important that we're talking about the language of UNCRC now when we look at policy, which we never had before, and making sure that departments understand the importance of mentioning that when they're looking at their policy and their legislation, even though we've kind of signed up to it in a, what would you say, in a very general way rather than incorporating it. But at least we're getting it step by step, because before you wouldn't even have talked about children's rights when I came in 2007, where at least now it's if you like on the agenda.
That is so true. And then you moved on from the, well, one of the things I was going to say, I noticed on LinkedIn that you still constantly support the current Commissioner for Children, which is lovely. I see you commenting on his work and whatnot. And I'm glad to hear that, people need mentors. They're in these big jobs. So it's good that he has you there as well. But then you moved on to be the CEO of the Northern Ireland Childminding Association.
Yeah.
So you didn't go back to politics. You stayed in the children's development, children's services world. What have been some of the things that have helped, I suppose, that you've been most proud of?
Well, I think I would like to think that I've raised the profile of registered childminders over the last 9 years. And just feedback from the childminders that we represent here, because we're a membership body. There's about 2,000 childminders in Northern Ireland. We have 1,400 as members. And so I have a childminding advisory committee that meets once a quarter. So they keep me on the straight and narrow. But and I have 4 members, childminders who are members of my board. So again, it's important that you have those structures in place and they have a voice. But I suppose my biggest achievement was to get funding for the registered childminders. So we were included in pathways this year. My next step was to get them included in fair play, but I'm hoping my successor will carry on with that job. And I think that was a big one. But also we now have academies in 11 councils to bring in new people into the sector, because sometimes it costs to become a registered childminder from the point of view of equipment and everything else. So these academies will help you get a kickstart, and we will obviously handhold you through the whole process.
So registration, education, qualifications, and
Yeah.
funding are the kind of component bits. And a bit like your colleague in Iceland said, you put the building blocks in one little bit at a time. Um, I remember as a social worker in 19, oh God, I'm not even going to say to date myself, asking somebody, a foster mother, to take one more child, and she pulled out a drawer in a chest of drawers.
Mm.
And I think she had 7 at the time, because we were just glad she was great, and we were just glad she would take another one. And look how far we've come. I mean, in those days, childminders there was no support system, they weren't registered, they were paid a pittance, and they didn't have any training. So massively, massively developed that whole sector now.
Absolutely. And while we've seen the subsidy for parents to help pay with childcare, and then we've seen the academies, we really need to talk about how we sustain those in the sector. And the pathways funding was a wee bit to help them, but you can imagine at the minute with all the overheads, with the cost of oil and everything else. So if you're a childminder, you can't turn your heating off for 2 hours in the morning because you have to keep your house at a certain temperature, and people don't understand that. And they're very loath to pass any of that cost on to parents, because they know some of their parents are struggling as it is, and maybe both parents out working. So it's about the sustainability of the sector as well, I think we need to look at, and to kind of make sure that we support them and keep those that we have in the sector.
Absolutely. And that's Department of Education lead on that currently, don't they?
Yeah, but we come under the Department of Health because we're regulated by health. So we
Okay.
didn't get any core grant this year because the it's been opened wide and everybody, and I believe that Department of Education should be funding us for a core grant so I can get money for my for all of my staff here from different projects, but I can't get any money to keep me in the middle to make sure all the projects are working, which is ridiculous, you know.
And that's back to leadership, because if you don't have strong leadership in these organizations and people who have the capacity to negotiate and influence and whatever, then, sadly, organizations could fold without that really
Yeah.
strong voice at
And
the
I
top.
think the other thing I'm quite proud of, and I'm hoping, and I'm sure my successor will carry on with, is that we did a big survey last year, Lynn, with families with children with additional needs or disabilities to
Mhm.
find out what kind of childcare they want. Was it full-time, part-time, ad hoc, or respite? And a lot of it came down to they just needed supported time. So there's a lot of people on direct payments that can't get anybody. So we've created approved home childcare that will actually go into your home and mind the children there. Because if your child is an additional need, sometimes their own home environment is where they're best suited rather than a child minding or childcare setting. So we're trying to build up that capacity at the minute. Because we want to manage the expectation of the parents because we know we'll be inundated. So we've done just a small matching service there. So we've worked with 3 or 4 families to match them up with approved home childcare. So we're trying to engage with them to come through the academies, but also maybe looking at where else could we get approved home childcare. So there's a lot of classroom assistants who will mind those children during the summertime, and they're not registered, so the parents can't claim their tax-free child credit or their subsidy. But if they came through and became an approved home childcare, then it's a win-win for everybody. So if you're an approved home childcare and you're employed by one family, then they have to be your employer. But I've been able to negotiate with the Department of Health and HMRC that if you have 2 families or more, then you can be self-employed, and it takes a lot of the angst out of it.
Oh, absolutely. Gosh, do you know what? Like such a simple thing that we could have someone go into somebody's home and help out. And
Yeah.
then, the work that had to go into making that get that approved is incredible. Is there scope for volunteers in that situation, Patricia?
Possibly. I mean, I think there's a lot of scope. So at this stage, what I'm trying to target is families with children with additional needs or disabilities because they're crying out for it more than anybody. But you could use this for people who live in rural areas, for instance, who have a family. So we've a lady here, we're trying to get her matched up for September. She has 4 children and she needs somebody to mind them in the morning to take them to school and then pick them up from school and mind them in the evening. So that approved home childcare could pick up another family even for 1 or 2 mornings a week. And that means that they can be self-employed then. But also that would help in rural areas because the anecdotal evidence tells us that if you can't get childcare close to home in a rural area, you'll take them to the nearest town. And then there's every chance that when they go to school, you'll take them to the nearest town too. So rural schools could benefit from this.
Mhm.
And we also had someone from Chest Heart and Stroke recently who came to us saying they had 2 young women who couldn't get childcare to do their rehabilitation. So my question to them is, well, who would pay for that? So you need to build that into whatever funding you're getting for that rehabilitation for those parents then to be able to. But an approved home childcare could go in and mind those children for the hour, 2 hours that that parent needs to go, or even somebody who's going for cancer treatment or
Yeah.
any kind of, and in England, the charities do pay for childcare for that because our childminders are actually full to capacity at the minute because
Mm.
of the demand. So you wouldn't always get the spaces that you would need on an ad hoc basis, whereas an approved home childcare that would suit them fine because it maybe only be for 6 weeks and then
I
they
love talking to people like you because it's so fascinating to see how the services are evolving, but as well as that, to see how the need is changing as the dynamic of families change. And then you have to be coming up all the time with the creative ideas with your other colleagues in the sector to come
yeah.
up with the creative ideas to try and meet that need. So
Yeah.
you said at the very beginning you're actually retiring from NICMA this week. So what is next for you?
Well, I have a few holidays planned, and apart from that, then I'm going to keep my hand in. I'm chair of training for Women's Network, and we do a lot of work with women, in particular from areas of disadvantage. And I also started an organisation 28 years ago called MAPA Men's Advisory Project, and we counsel the male victims of domestic violence. And so therefore, I'm chair of it as well. So I'd be able to give a wee bit more time to that. And we actually just got some money from Children in Need to run a project for young boys who are now presenting between 13 and 18 who have been living in homes where there has been domestic violence and they're living with that trauma now.
Yeah, and also, are you doing some work with those adolescents who are already showing signs of being potentially violent within the family situation as well?
Well, not really, but we are looking at maybe devising some training. We used to call it anger management. We don't like to call it that now. We like to call it managing your emotions. So
Mhm.
and some of those young people could probably have been young people who were living in homes where there was domestic violence and didn't know how to manage those emotions as they got older.
Yeah.
Am I expected to be like my dad or, maybe drugs, alcohol, you don't know. So yeah.
But that's a brilliant project because I think the male victims of domestic violence are people just aren't aware of just how many of them there are, and the services for them are very limited as well.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't get anywhere near the amount of money that Women's Aid would get, and there's no refuges for men. But
Mhm.
also, when you look at the issues for men, they're much different than they are for women because they can't take their children with them, because very
Mhm.
often the courts would give the children back. But it's just a very different process. And as you say, there's not always the services. We've had men that have nothing except for what they stand up in, and we've had to give them money even just to buy food and trying to educate employers that this happens to men as well as women, and you need to be, but then men are very private and they probably don't want their employer to know because people will say that big burly man and that wee tiny woman, my goodness, do you know what I mean? So it's all that perception and it takes a while to kind of work that system through. And we started with volunteers and we've had a small amount of money over the years to keep a coordinator going or a CEO now, but it's very difficult because we do not get the same amount of funding as you say as others would. And it was a bit disappointing because I thought it should have been a women and children's strategy rather than a women and girls. And it's interesting, we know that there's 30 women have lost their lives.
Yes.
But there's 12 men have lost their lives as well during that time, and there's not a mention of any of them. And that's sad, you know.
That is really terribly sad, and I had not been aware that the figure was so high. Um, how do you keep, like, your energy is just always at a really high level, working with some of these really challenging situations where sometimes it feels like there's no resource coming from anywhere? How do you keep so focused and motivated?
I suppose it's just that's the nature of me. I just keep going at it because eventually maybe you'll get through to somebody, but it's also using your networks and others. And it was sad recently because we had a conference, MAP had a conference a couple of Mondays ago, and I was talking to a politician there, and he was saying he knows that of at least three politicians who have been affected by domestic violence, not directly themselves, but one is a grandfather and hasn't seen his grandchildren in 6 years because his daughter-in-law has this coercive control over their son. But they're afraid to mention it because they're afraid of the backlash because it's all about women and girls. And I
Yeah.
thought that was sad. So my mission is to have the conversation with those uh, politicians to see what support we can give them, but also how can we highlight the issue in the chamber where they feel comfortable to be able to have that conversation.
And also, when people like that who have influence are enabled to talk about their experience, it frees other people, doesn't it? To say, oh my goodness, if it could happen to them, it could happen to me. And people will believe me now. So,
And very often when you do something, it's when you find out. So, for instance, we would have done disability training in the assembly for all the assembly members. And it wasn't until we had that training that we realized that we had assembly members who had hearing problems. We had
mhm.
assembly member who had two sons who were profoundly deaf. So, you find that out as you go along. And even the all party working group on diabetes, I felt there was the all party working group queen at one stage with all the ones that we set up. But even the number of MLAs who had diabetes who were interested in that. Now, it didn't meet It only met a few times a year, an update on statistics and things, but it was about raising the profile, which I think is important. But it's when you run those kinds of things or have those kinds of conversations, like I had with somebody on the day of MAPS conference, that I realized that there were actually MLAs who were struggling with this issue, you know?
And it's so funny because I mean, my husband's a surgeon, and the number of surgeons who are on the autistic spectrum is incredible. Not just on the spectrum, but their skills in so many ways in terms of communication, negotiating, but they are brilliant technically. Um,
Absolutely.
and it's only whenever you have the conversations that you realize that no help was available for them on the way through. Just sheer grit and just being good technically was enough to get them through. But so many complaints nowadays are not about necessarily the outcome of a procedure, but they didn't like the doctor or they didn't like the nurse. So there's a real big piece of work still need to be done on communication skills, facilitating rapport, regardless what kind of service we're in. We all need to do better. You're a natural at communicating with people across the social spectrum and, folks with disabilities. And hopefully, I think maybe so am I. But there are lots of people that aren't for all kinds of reasons. And we need
But
to get better.
I also believe everybody should have a social conscience. So I employ a young person here who's on the autism spectrum. Now he comes in 3 mornings a week, and gosh, help him, he's worried about me leaving because he thinks he's never going to see me again. And I said that'll not be the case. But his job could be done by anybody, but it means a difference to him. And
Yeah.
he comes in 3 mornings a week. It gives him a purpose. He's able to drive, but his short-term memory's bad. He can't,
Yeah.
if I say something to him, the time he gets to the office, he can't remember it. But when he started here, couldn't answer the phones. Now he answers the phones and he takes a message. He's been with us 4 years, and he's just part of the staff team. And the staff in the office are down about him, and he's down about them. But I know sometimes when we're worried about budgets and everything else, that's the easy part to cut. But actually, the difference that makes in his life is more important. But actually, how he enriches our lives is more important for me than what we give him.
Well, you preempted my final question, which was this podcast goes out to about 400 leaders in health and social care, attached to an article which will hopefully adequately summarize all the great things you've talked about. It also goes out on LinkedIn and Spotify and Buzzsprout and all the other platforms. So you have a platform. My question was, what else can we do? Speaking to that audience, what else can we do to help people like you in your drive to have greater engagement, greater social awareness, greater opportunities for people who are less fortunate?
I always say never judge someone else until you've walked in their shoes.
Yeah.
Because I can give you advice at something and that's fine because I'm not emotionally involved. But if I'm in your shoes, I'm emotionally involved and I might think things differently. So never judge somebody for that. That's what I always say. Because you might be taken aback at the decision that they make, but they may make it for a reason that you don't understand. So that would be my big thing is don't judge somebody else. And when somebody says no to you, first of all, you'll know yourself whether it's worth pursuing or not. And sometimes people are set in their ways, and that's okay. You have to take that as it comes. But I find very often most people are open to the conversation of some sort. And if you can find that common thread or common ground, then it's a win-win for everybody, you know?
Beautiful. I think you're right, common thread, but don't take no, the first no as the answer. Sometimes you need lots of no's before you get to yes.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
we wish you well with whatever else you do. I know there's no way that you're retiring. You'll find lots of projects and things to do, but enjoy those holidays as well. And thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Lovely to see you again.
Well, today's guest, Patricia Lewsley-Mooney, really exemplifies that there is a formula for success. She brought masses of energy to the game, and energy is infectious. And it's up to us as leaders to show up with lots of positive energy. Also, you need common sense and a practical approach to get things done. She talked about collaboration being absolutely critical, and she wasn't afraid to ask people to help. And she set up so many all-party groups to progress a whole range of policy issues. And they were successful because she helped people identify the common purpose from each of the group and helped them to see how it would benefit their family, their constituency. You have to help people to see the benefits. And she's got a really strong moral compass, really into how to promote rights for everyone, and in particular, those with a disability and children who are marginalised. And that little story she told about the child who, if he had all the money in the world, would just want to buy a packet of crisps and a can of Coke at the local shop, really, really hits home. She's also incredibly realistic. She recognized that change takes time and change takes a really good strategy. And she said that her colleague in Iceland taught her that you have to identify the building blocks and then keep stacking them so that the result is almost inevitable. Patricia also reminded us, and that was very poignant, that men are victims of domestic violence as well. And through her men's advisory project, which she's run for more than 20 years, she's raised awareness and supported men to move on. I asked her for her advice and for people coming through nowadays, and she said, never judge anyone until you've walked in their shoes. And that's really, really good advice. And she also said, don't stop when you get a no. Just keep trying different approaches and look for people who will work with you towards a common goal. So, success is never accidental. So, my challenge for you as leaders this week is, where could you do just a little bit more? What project or idea needs your support? How can you add more value?